is it that makes you highly creative? Because a lot of people will say, well, everyone's creative. What is it that makes you more creative than someone else?
Great question. I do believe that everybody's creative. It's one of the things that I speak and write about, that I hope everyone will tap into the creative potential that they have. I think what makes me highly creative is that I do so many disparate things. I'm a fine artist. I paint. Um, I'm a theater professor. I write plays. I speak. I do a podcast. I do a variety of creative things. Um, and so many that so many times people don't believe how many different things that I do.
And the other thing about creativity is that apart from this kind of general consensus that everyone is potentially creative, is that, tell me what you think about this, that people think that a highly creative person is creative in everything. Is it possible for someone to be highly creative in everything, or do we need to discover particular skills, particular traits that we excel in more than others?
I would say, just like we don't all do everything well in daily life, that the same is true for creativity. I believe there are people that can excel at a lot of things, but I don't think everyone's highly creative in all things. I think we generally steer towards those things which greatly interest us, or for which we have the most, you know, natural giftedness. And I don't think everyone's gifted in every way. So I think the same would be true of creativity.
So how did you discover what you were best at, or what you were, most creative in?
I think over the years, I just dabbled in so many things. And I think persistence is part of creativity, being able to stay with something long enough to know if it is a good fit. And I remember when I started guitar lessons when I was 12, and my mother said, "You have to do this for at least a year." And I thought, oh, that's a huge commitment. But at 12, I thought it's also probably wise. So even at 12, I realized that I probably won't know if I'm good at this until I give it a real good try. So I ended up taking 5 years of guitar lessons, and that was a great thing. But I do think it takes some time to flush out what you're good at and what you aren't.
So did you find that you were ever at a level where you could be creative in playing guitar?
Yeah, it's not my first gift, guitar. I am a musician, but I don't consider that the thing that I excel at. So I do that more for my own personal enjoyment. Um, but um, I think it's a combination of seeing enough results soon enough to, I guess, continue that interest and that excitement over something. If you don't see results after you toil away at it and you're just still at the same place, I think you tend to abandon that and to determine, oh, that I'm not good at that.
Yeah, the results, that's like a key thing, isn't it? That
Yes.
takes me back to this social evaluation aspect, because some people think that, or if you've done 10,000 hours in
Yes.
mastering a skill, that should lead to a point where you can be creative. But as you say, you could be playing guitar and you might have mastered all the structural skills related to guitar playing or any other artistic work. But if it doesn't produce results, and by results, perhaps you mean in terms of outcomes, in terms of other people enjoying what you're doing,
Yes.
paying for what you're producing in terms of art. So how is it that you cope, or you deal with this social evaluation aspect of creativity? Because as we both agree, everyone has the potential to be creative, and it does require persistence, it requires mastering that skill. But even after we've mastered that skill, people might not think that we're as good as we think ourselves to be.
Yeah, that's an interesting aspect of creativity, isn't it? I mean, we so often rely on others to validate And I think of famous artists throughout history who maybe were not famous until long after they were gone, because no one bought their work. Does that mean that they weren't great artists, or that they were maybe ahead of their time, or at least out of their time in terms of being appreciated? I think that's some of the tragedies that we've seen among great fine artists, is that they, or even musicians, is that they weren't necessarily famous in their own lifetime. And does that make them less of artists? You
Well,
know, yeah, I think that social validation is important, but I also believe that if you believe in and if you like your work, then the confidence which you project also has something to do with how other people see you.
well, my belief is that creativity, there's a time and place for it. You know, the context has to be right for it. So Van Gogh, during his lifetime, he didn't sell any paintings apart from maybe one or two to his brother, and that wasn't the right time for him.
Right.
Maybe in, you know, at the time that he lived, or, you know, we can cite lots of other musicians and artists in a similar category where during their lifetime they weren't considered to be creative. It wasn't the right time. So
Right.
creativity needs to be contextualized within a time frame.
Yes. Yes. Well said.
So, so in terms of your work, in enabling other people to be creative, how do you do that? What, because sometimes it's very easy to be creative ourselves, but it's the difficulty or the challenge can be in empowering other people to be creative. So what do you recommend to others who want to be more creative than they consider themselves to be?
I think a lot of people believe that if you are good at something, it is that sort of 10,000 hours myth, that I think has been largely debunked. But certainly creates, certainly it requires a body of time, um, practicing, experimenting, whatever the art form is or whatever the creative outlet. But I think the myth is that the best art or the best creativity comes from those that are highly trained or highly skilled. For instance, at 32, I decided, oh, I want to try to be an artist. I have no art training. I have never taken an art class in my life, but I consider it one of my best skills compared to earning a master's degree in communications and theater, in which I spent many, many hours learning. I think I'm good at that, but I think that my most joy comes from, you know, experimenting with painting. And so the social validation, I guess, is that I've sold art to every state in the United States and to several foreign countries as validation that people like my art. But back to your question in terms of how do we, I lost sight of the question, shoot. Um,
It's about, yeah, that it's very interesting what you just say about the fact that the the skill that you had mastered wasn't necessarily the skill that you were most creative in, whereas it's almost as though you stumbled upon the skill that you are creative in that has the most social validation. Because,
yeah, and
yeah, carry on.
yes, and I try to tell people my story, you know, when they admire my art, and a lot of people know that I, you know, went to college and grad school, but they don't necessarily know what I studied. And so they assume it's art. And so I try to tell my story that I'm self-taught. I read a lot. I watch a lot of video. I go to a lot of museums to try and study what the old masters did, and just to learn what makes great art, and then to shake up the notion of that. To say, all right, that, you know, there was a time for surrealism, there was a time for pointillism, and are those still valid today? What can we do new and different with them? And so I try to tell my own story of it. I think my best creativity comes from my own curiosity and my own sort of insatiable desire to keep learning and growing and experimenting. Same with the art materials that I use. Yes, a lot of times I paint on canvas, but I just did a whole series of paintings on old LP record albums, or on old upcycled billboard, which I painted on and cut up and wove together into different weavings. And so the use of odd materials or unusual materials is as much a part of my art as the way that I paint. So that is definitely outside of the box, if you will.
Yes, I've seen some of your artwork, and it is very, it's very refreshing to see all those colours, the bright colours, and perhaps the fact that you are self-taught, it enabled you to bring a fresh perspective, whereas if you'd studied with some masters, you might have been overly influenced by their biases, perhaps.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because the longer I've taught in higher education, the more I wonder if the very structure of higher education, if that is not unnecessarily shaping thoughts, that can we still teach, but maybe make the conclusions or the process a little bit more unfettered to allow people to sort of come to their own ideas? Are we necessarily forcing a model on students that might fit us but doesn't fit the student? And it's something I've wrestled with the longer I've taught. Sometimes I think to myself, I'm not sure if I believe in the current model of higher education, because it definitely instructs in a certain way. It definitely leads a student down a certain path. And for those that really think wildly outside of the box, it may actually do them a disservice. So yeah, sometimes I think, if I had formally studied art, would I still have this abandon? Or would I have a voice in my head saying, oh, we never do this, or nobody ever did that? And so would I shy away from those things? I do think I have a freedom in my art, because I've not maybe learned all the rules, so I feel free to break them.
And Susan, I think the problem that you outlined there is probably even greater at the pre-university level of education, because at higher education, I think there is more scope for people to be creative, perhaps because it's like pushing through those boundaries. But at the compulsory school education, I was talking to a colleague of mine who teaches art. She actually inspects artwork, and I thought that she would not have a problem with lack of creativity in students' work. And she shocked me by saying, well, no, when she inspects artwork, she's so disappointed at how similar it all is. You know, it's like mass production. So even when a teacher is following an art curriculum, the students are still producing work which fits into that box. There's a lack of creativity there as well.
That's interesting, because I've read a few studies that show that creativity in children is at the genius level until they start formal education. And then when they start formal education until about age 10, studies have shown that creativity has decreased. And that by the time we get to the adult level, where we might have been genius level at age 3, we are very much under the norm when we get to be adults. And I think, well, what has challenged that level of creativity? Is it the world telling you to do things a certain way? I don't know. I won't draw those conclusions, and I'm certainly not a neuroscientist. So, but it does make you wonder if that formal structure of things doesn't sort of alter the way we think and process and have that freedom to create.
Well, it's about meeting expectations. And again, it's, you know, when we want to pass an exam, even if it's an art exam, we know that we need to conform to what the examiners are expecting.
Yeah,
and with your work, you know, if an organization asks you to produce particular artwork and they specify to you their criteria, you won't have the scope to be creative, whereas you're in a privileged position where you create your work and then look for who is interested in it.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Well said. Well, I always think of the scripture that says that there's nothing new under the sun in Ecclesiastes. And I think that really is true. I think there is nothing new, but I think my particular passion, I guess, is how we combine ideas. And I think there are new combination of ideas. And that's what I've sort of thrown myself into studying is how do we combine different ideas to make something that is fairly new, and sort of debunking that scripture, if you will, or showing it to be maybe not as completely um, all black and white, if you will. And I do think that people have come up with some very original combinations of ideas over the years. And I think we're hung up on being original. I think if we really look at originality, you know, I think about how Picasso said that art is theft, and about how he talked about stealing really looking at other people's ideas and sort of stealing them and making them your own. Um, William Ralph Inge said, what is creativity? It's undetected plagiarism. And so I think about how we think about being original and creative, and I really think that we're all sort of doing a variation on a theme, and some are closer to being alike than others. I'm always inspired by people that seem to do something that nobody's seen before, but in actuality, they've probably just had an amalgamation of ideas over time, like we all have.
Well, I think it's commonly acknowledged that creativity doesn't occur in a vacuum.
Correct.
Ideas come from other ideas. We build on ideas that have gone on for thousands of years before us.
Yes, and sometimes we don't even realize how we've been influenced. It can be very, very subtle that we'll pick up on an idea or a concept and sort of make it our own. And that's what's really exciting about creativity is it doesn't seem, you know, it doesn't seem to end. There seems to be no end to the expression, the human expression, and how we seek to express all of those feelings and ideas that we have. There just seems to be no end to it.
That's right. There's you know, it's infinite, isn't it? You know, the
Yeah.
ideas that we have, they are infinite. There isn't a lack of ideas.
No.